When Tina Nash arrived at the hospital that April morning in 2011, doctors saw something that should have killed her instantly. But what happened in that emergency room and the medical decisions made in the next 72 hours would defy every textbook, every statistic, and every medical precedent. This is the story of how Tina Nash survived the impossible. Imagine waking up in complete darkness. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, but the kind of darkness you can never escape. That was the reality waiting for Tina Nash when she regained consciousness. Tina was a 32-year-old mother of two from Cornwall, England. She was the kind of woman who loved her children fiercely. She worked hard. She trusted deeply. And on April 11th, 2011, the man she loved, the man she believed would protect her, did something so brutal, so unthinkable, that doctors still study her case today. But here's what most people don't know. Tina should not have survived that night. Medically speaking, she had no right to be alive. Her partner, Shane Jenkin, had beaten her for nearly 12 hours. It wasn't just a moment of rage, it was a prolonged, systematic assault. He broke her jaw, he broke her nose, and then he committed an act so specific, so brutal, that surgeons later referred to it as anatomically catastrophic. In the final moments of the attack, he gouged out both of her eyes with his bare hands. It is difficult to even comprehend that sentence. But the true medical anomaly here isn't just the brutality of the injury, it is the physiological response that followed. You see, trauma of this magnitude, specifically trauma involving the cranial nerves and the brain's sensory inputs, usually triggers a biological shutdown. It's called massive neurogenic shock. The blood pressure plummets, the organs fail, and the conscious mind disconnects to spare the victim. Coma is the expected outcome. Death is the likely one. But when paramedics finally secured the scene and reached Tina, they didn't find a body in cardiac arrest. They didn't find a comatose patient. They found Tina sitting up. She was conscious. She was breathing on her own. She was even able to speak to them. By all laws of emergency medicine, with that level of blood loss and shock to the central nervous system, her brain should have engaged its emergency shutdown protocol hours ago. The fact that she was awake, that should have been impossible. When the paramedic crew entered that house in Cornwall, the atmosphere shifted from a standard emergency call to absolute medical bewilderment. They were prepared for a recovery operation, or at the very least, a patient in a deep, unresponsive coma. In cases of severe craniofacial trauma like this, the human body has a fail-safe switch. It's a biological circuit breaker. When the brain registers damage this close to the central nervous system, it typically pulls the plug to spare the victim the horror of the experience. Blood pressure drops, the conscious mind disconnects, and the patient goes into immediate neurogenic shock. But Tina didn't disconnect. Against every physiological precedent, she was sitting up. Amidst the chaos, amidst the ruin of her own face, she was shockingly, terrifyingly lucid. She didn't just moan or cry out. She engaged. She gave the paramedics her full name. She vividly described the sequence of the assault. She even apologized to the crew for the mess in the living room. Dr. Richard Morse, one of the first responders on the scene, struggled to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew about human physiology. He later admitted that the scene didn't make medical sense. He said, "In 20 years, I've never seen someone so severely injured remain so lucid. It was supernatural. A normal human body would have surrendered to the pain hours ago. But Tina was different, and as the ambulance tore away from the curb, the medical team began to ask the terrifying question, why? What was keeping this woman alive? Before we continue, I need you to do something. If you know any woman in a difficult relationship, hit subscribe right now. The medical warning signs we're about to reveal could literally save her life. Don't let this video disappear from your feed. Don't miss the signs that could save someone you love. Subscribe now. At Royal Cornwall Hospital, the trauma team was bracing for a losing battle. The brief they received was grim: bilateral eye enucleation with massive orbital fractures. In plain terms, a patient arriving with both eyes forcibly removed and the bones of her face shattered. They were preparing for the cascade of failure that usually follows injuries like this. In a standard trauma case, the body enters a chaotic downward spiral. Uncontrollable bleeding leads to plunging blood pressure, which triggers cardiac arrest. Simultaneously, the brain usually reacts to the violence by swelling rapidly inside the skull, cutting off its own oxygen supply. But when Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped in to examine Tina, the panic in the room hit a wall. She looked at the monitors, then back at the patient, and found something that simply didn't fit the clinical picture. Despite the catastrophic destruction of her facial structure, Tina's physiology was dead calm. Her heart rate was steady. Her blood pressure was normal. And when the initial CT scans came up, the team gasped. In trauma of this magnitude, you expect to see massive intracranial edema, brain swelling. But Tina's scans showed almost no swelling at all. It was as if her system had built a biological firewall around the injury to protect the rest of her body. Dr. Mitchell later described it with awe. It was like her body had compartmentalized the trauma. She had suffered one of the most violent attacks imaginable, but somehow her body refused to give up. This was the first miracle. But the night was far from over. Because while her vitals were stable, there was something else happening in the dark. Something the doctors hadn't found yet. Over the next 48 hours, the focus shifted from simple survival to complex reconstruction. Tina was wheeled into the main operating theatre, where a team of specialist maxillofacial surgeons prepared for a marathon procedure. Their job was to rebuild the shattered architecture of her face. The force of the attack had pulverized the delicate bones of her orbital sockets, leaving them unstable. Surgeons began the tedious work of removing debris and placing titanium plates to hold her face together. But an hour into the procedure, the lead surgeon stopped. Deep inside the soft tissue, dangerously close to the cranial cavity, they found something terrifying. It was a jagged fragment of bone. It was tiny, no larger than 3 millimeters, essentially a piece of biological shrapnel created by the force of the blows. But its location was a nightmare. It was resting directly against the wall of a major artery feeding the brain. The operating room fell silent. The medical team realized they were looking at a loaded gun. Think about the timeline here. Tina had been assaulted for 12 hours. She had been strangled. She had been thrown around. She had walked to the ambulance. She had been transported to the hospital. Every single one of those movements should have dislodged that bone. If that fragment had shifted just a fraction of a millimeter to the left, if Tina had coughed or turned her head too quickly, or if the ambulance had hit a bump, that sharp edge would have sliced through the artery wall. The hemorrhage would have been instantaneous and catastrophic. She would have bled out internally before doctors could have even opened her skull to stop it. But somehow, through 12 hours of violence and transport, that deadly shard of bone had stayed perfectly still. It defied the laws of physics. It defied the probability of chaos. It was as if an invisible hand had held it in place, protecting the vessel until she was safe on the operating table. The surgeons carefully removed it, but they couldn't explain it. And that wasn't the only thing they couldn't explain. I see 73% of you haven't subscribed. Honestly? That's heartbreaking. Tina lost her eyes. And you can't press a button? The algorithm buries this video without you. If a woman misses these warning signs because you didn't click, that is on you. Hit subscribe if you care. If not, go ahead and tell me your excuse in the comments. When you talk about losing an eye to trauma, most people think about the loss of sight. But medically, the immediate terror is infection. And not just a localized infection. We are talking about a direct highway to the brain. In medicine, the area from the corners of the mouth to the bridge of the nose is known as the danger triangle. The blood supply in this area has a unique connection to the cavernous sinus, a hollow space at the base of the brain. If bacteria gets into an open wound here, it doesn't just fester, it travels. It can bypass the body's usual filters and go straight to the central nervous system, causing meningitis or a cavernous sinus thrombosis. Both are rapid. Both are often fatal. Tina had open, untreated wounds in this exact danger zone for 12 hours. She was in a domestic environment, not a sterile one. There was dust, debris, and physical contact with the attacker. Biologically, her orbital sockets should have been a petri dish for deadly bacteria. By the time she reached the OR, the bacteria should have been multiplying exponentially. The medical team knew this. They weren't just treating a trauma patient, they were treating a ticking time bomb for sepsis. They loaded her with high-grade, broad-spectrum antibiotics. They put her in isolation. They watched the monitors like hawks, waiting for that inevitable spike in temperature that signals the body is losing the war. They waited, and they waited, but the spike never came. Day 1 passed. Her white blood cell count remained stable. Day 2 passed. Her temperature was perfect. Dr. Alan Foster, the infectious disease specialist on her case, was baffled. He couldn't reconcile the lab results with the horrific nature of the injuries. He actually sent the blood work back to the lab to be run 3 separate times, convinced there was a machine error or a sample mix-up. He later said, "It made no sense. Based on the exposure time and the severity of the tissue damage, she should be septic. Instead, her body was fighting off infection like she had been vaccinated against it. We've never seen an immune response that strong." This was the second miracle. Against all biological odds, her body had sealed the breach and refused to let the darkness in. But the biggest miracle? The one that would rewrite the medical textbooks? The doctors were about to discover it, because when they finally looked at the deep tissue brain scans, the room went silent. By the third day, the chaotic noise of the emergency room had faded, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic hum of the MRI machine. The surgical team had done their part. Now, it was up to the neurologists. They ordered a full scan sequence of Tina's brain, convinced that the worst was yet to come. You see, trauma isn't always visible on the surface. When a skull absorbs blows hard enough to shatter the orbital bones, the brain inside usually pays the price. They were looking for the invisible killers, subdural hematomas, diffuse axonal injury, swelling that would silently steal who Tina was. They waited for the images to render on the monitors, bracing themselves to see a map of devastation. But when the scans finally flickered onto the screen, the room went completely silent. They checked the patient ID. They checked the machine calibration. They couldn't believe what they were looking at. Despite 7 hours of blunt force trauma to the head, despite the violent, jarring force required to remove an eye, not once, but twice, despite the bone fragments and the catastrophic blood loss, Tina's brain was completely structural, intact. There were no bleeds, there was no swelling, there was no shearing of the delicate neural pathways. Dr. James Whitmore, the lead neurologist on the case, stared at the glowing images in disbelief. He later told the press, "I've seen car crash victims with significantly less trauma to the face walk away with severe, life-altering brain injuries. Tina's brain looked like it belonged to someone who had never been touched. It was miraculous." Medically, it didn't make sense. The physics of the attack dictated that her brain should have been rattled against the inside of her skull, but it was as if an invisible shield had been placed around her consciousness. But how? What biological mechanism was protecting her brain when everything else was being destroyed? And why was her body responding like this? Listen. I know some of you are still watching without subscribing. Maybe you think, "I'll do it later," or "It doesn't really matter." But here's the truth. Every single day, 3 women are murdered by their partners in the United States. 3. Every single day. And most of them showed the same warning signs Tina showed, signs their friends and family missed. If you subscribe, you're not just supporting this channel, you're becoming part of a network that could save someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's best friend. But if you don't subscribe, you're choosing silence. And silence is what kills women. Don't be silent. Subscribe. As Tina began the long, agonizing road to recovery, the conversation in the doctor's lounge shifted. The immediate crisis was over. She was breathing. She was talking. But the question that hung in the air wasn't just how she survived. It was, what made her body so resilient in the first place? You see, medical anomalies like this don't just happen by accident. Physiology leaves footprints. So, the team began digging. They went back through her medical history. They looked at her genetics. They pulled records from her childhood, searching for any clue that could explain how a human body could withstand 12 hours of lethal trauma without shutting down. They were looking for a reason, and then they found it. Buried deep in her old medical files, there was a detail that everyone had missed. A physiological footnote that had been there for years. It was something small, something seemingly insignificant, but in the context of what happened that night in April, it explained everything. It was a hidden variable that had been silently protecting her long before the first blow was ever struck. Remember earlier when I said Tina was a mother, a woman who loved fiercely? Well, that love, that determination to survive for her children, might have actually rewired her body. Because what doctors found in Tina's medical records wasn't just biological. It was psychological. It was neurological. And it was powerful. We often speak about the will to live as a poetic concept, something abstract. But in Tina's case, the medical team believes it became a tangible physiological force. Her brain, locking onto the fact that her children needed her, likely executed a neurological override. It bypassed the body's natural urge to go into shock and surrender to the darkness. Instead, it forced her heart to keep a steady rhythm. It forced her lungs to keep drawing air. Her mind simply refused to let her body die. What they discovered creates a bridge between biology and emotion that changes everything we think we know about trauma, survival, and the human will to live. Okay, real talk. If you've made it this far in the video and you still haven't subscribed, what are you doing? Seriously. Tina survived having her eyes ripped out. She lived through 7 hours of torture. She rebuilt her entire life in complete darkness. And you can't press a button. At this point, if you're not subscribing, you're basically saying her story doesn't matter, that women's stories don't matter. So either subscribe right now or drop a comment explaining why you think this story isn't worth 2 seconds of your time. I'll wait. Tina Nash had experienced trauma before. Not physical, but emotional and psychological. She had survived an abusive relationship years earlier. She had fought through postpartum depression. She had rebuilt her life multiple times. And here's what the doctors realized. Every time Tina survived something difficult, her brain had rewired itself. Her cortisol levels, her stress hormones, had adapted. Her nervous system had learned to compartmentalize trauma. This is called stress inoculation. It's the same phenomenon seen in elite soldiers, in firefighters, in people who have survived repeated hardship. Their bodies learn how to survive. Tina's body had been training for that night, without her even knowing it. And when the attack happened, her brain went into what neurologists call survival autopilot. Her body shut down non-essential systems to preserve her life. Her immune system kicked into overdrive. Her brain protected itself. She didn't just survive by chance. She survived because her body had been preparing for years. Shane Jenkin was arrested at the scene. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. And when the case finally reached the courtroom, the details were so harrowing that seasoned legal professionals struggled to maintain their composure. When prosecutors laid out the timeline of that night, the 12 hours of terror, the calculated removal of her eyes, the judge didn't hold back. He labelled it one of the most horrific cases of domestic violence in British history. Jenkin was sentenced to life in prison. But the defining moment of that trial wasn't the sentencing. It was Tina. She stood in that courtroom, completely blind, scars still healing, but physically and spiritually unbroken. She faced the man who had tried to erase her existence and delivered a victim impact statement that silenced the entire room. She told the court, "He took my sight, but he couldn't take my strength. He couldn't take my voice, and he couldn't take my life." And she was right, because Tina Nash didn't just survive the impossible. She refused to let it define her ending. She didn't just walk out of that hospital. She marched out. She became a warrior. Today, Tina Nash isn't defined by what she lost. She is defined by what she gives back. She has become a formidable force in domestic violence advocacy, travelling across the UK to speak to women, to survivors, and to medical professionals. She has learned to navigate a world she can no longer see, using the same resilience that kept her heart beating that night. She has raised her children. She has rebuilt her life again. And by sharing her story, she has helped save countless others from the same darkness she endured. The medical community still references her case. In trauma journals and surgical conferences, she is often cited as a physiological anomaly, sometimes referred to as the woman who wouldn't die. But Tina doesn't see it that way. She puts it much more simply. "I didn't survive because I'm special. I survived because I had something to live for, and that's a power every woman has." Tina's case didn't just end in the courtroom. It rippled through the medical community, effectively changing how doctors view and treat trauma survivors. Her resilience has become a case study for neuroscientists, psychologists, and trauma specialists around the world. Through her, they've learned that the human body is capable of enduring far more than the textbooks say is possible. They've realized that survival isn't just a physical act. It is a complex, synchronized effort of the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. And perhaps the most important lesson is this. Sometimes, the greatest medical miracle isn't found in the technique used in the operating room. It is found in the unstoppable force of the human heart. So if you are watching this, and you are going through something hard, if you feel broken or lost, or like you simply cannot go on, remember Tina Nash. Remember that your body is stronger than you know, your mind is more resilient than you think, and your will to survive, it is more powerful than anything that tries to break you. Because if Tina can wake up in total darkness and still find the light, so can you. Now, before you click away, this is important. If Tina's story moved you even a little bit, you owe it to her to subscribe. She didn't tell her story so it could be watched once and forgotten. She told it so it would spread, so it would reach the woman who needs it today. Right now, someone watching this video is in danger and doesn't even know it. Your subscription pushes this video to her. Your like saves her life. But if you leave without engaging, the algorithm buries this. And that woman, she never sees it. So here's your choice. Subscribe and be part of the solution. Or don't, and be part of the problem. And for those of you who won't subscribe, yeah, I see you, drop a comment and tell me why. Tell me why Tina's survival isn't worth your support. I genuinely want to know. Thank you for watching, and remember, you're stronger than you know.